Welcome to the Language Access Lectern, a PGLS podcast focused on language access in K-12 schools. I'm your host, Mark Byrne. All right, welcome back for another edition of the Language Access Lectern. Today, we have a very exciting guest. We're going to talk a lot about the impact that language services can have on language access and language acquisition for multilingual families. So I'm really excited to have that conversation with Tim Fournier. Another aspect of our conversation that we're going to touch on today, kind of unique. Tim has a 30-year career in education, working, with students in the classroom as a principal, as an administrator at Grand Rapids Public Schools. He has an incredible career. He's going to tell us a little bit about his origin story, how he got into the industry, and how he works with the multilingual students and families in their community. But Tim also approached me recently, and we had some conversations. And Tim has actually, become a freelance contractor with PGLS, working with us as an interpreter for Spanish-speaking students. So we're really excited to talk with Tim about his career and then, his, next evolution of his career, joining PGLS as a contract freelance interpreter to continue to support multilingual families all across the country and supporting PGLS and their partnerships. So without further ado, I want to welcome Tim Fournier and give him the opportunity for the very first time to step to the lectern and introduce himself to all of our listeners out there. So Tim, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and we'll get our conversation started.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction and for your time. Very excited to meet you and learn more about your organization, which I think I learned by way of my work. I retired as a principal 2 years ago, and I've been contracted with a district in what we call Up North Michigan, a small rural district that happens to have a pretty non-traditional rural population. We have a lot of particularly Cuban, but Hispanic families moving in, a lot of African-American families that have lived here for years in what historical Idlewild community. We can talk about that later. Anyways, I was approached by your company to see if your services could be utilized in our area, in our county. So I did some research and was very impressed. Being semi-retired, I thought I'd reach out and look at how I might be able to help, because it looked like what you were doing, what your organization was doing, was desperately needed throughout my 30-some years in bilingual programs. Usually, I use the term de facto, usually was an on-staff person or a community person that could support us. We didn't have a sustained, committed interpreter service that's looked down as an extravagance, even though you and I know how essential that is to serve our populations. So that's why I'm here today. Actually, you were so kind to reach out to me to see if we'd like to chat sometime this summer. And that's what today is all about. I've been really looking forward to this, one bilingual educator talking to another.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nothing better.
Tim, why don't you share with us a little bit about your origin story, right? Tell me how you, developed your multilingual skills. Tell me how you got into education, and tell me how you're able to kind of marry the two, right? A bilingual skill set and, a career in education, and how do those come together? Like, what does that look like, early on in your career?
Early on, it was actually, I'm the last, you would think I'd be demographically, the last candidate to ever become a bilingual educator. I was born and raised on the east side of Detroit, close ties to Canada. For those of you who know Detroit, we're just across the river. Mm-hmm. So I always had family over there. I actually lived there in elementary school for a couple of years, where French was the second language there's no issue about it. You learned French in the schools. Mm-hmm. You had a lot of Francophone neighbors. In fact, in Canada, I'm Fournier. Go across the river to Detroit, I'm Fournier. So, it was also always amazing to me how, even the Portuguese that lived in southwestern Ontario, we had quite a Portuguese population. And that was just accepted as maybe a third local language. Whereas back home across the river, that was seen just as so foreign to be compatible. We were actually suspect of foreign languages. So I'm the until the age of 20, 21, I'm the last candidate that you would think of to be a bilingual educator. I was able to fulfill a dream I had as a young man and join the Peace Corps. After working a few years I was a law clerk in a law firm that serviced the Latino community. And I also worked in a family service agency that was in the Hispanic neighborhood of Detroit called Mexican Town. So that's where I was able to actually acquire some language, just the goodness of the heart of my clients and my colleagues.
Okay.
When I was able to go to the Peace Corps, which is just a dream of mine, I was able to do a few years after college. That's really where I became a language learner.
Yeah.
Not just in the 3 months of training, but when I was out in the field. And did that change my mindset, being actually someone who was a language minority, trying to grasp language for survival and for success of my projects.
Wow. Where did your service in the Peace Corps take you?
Dominican Republic and Haiti, mostly Dominican Republic.
Wow. Mm-hmm. What was that experience like? My goodness. Sounds amazing.
It was bizarre. Having been born and raised in Detroit, my dad was a Detroit policeman. So we lived in Detroit, and, throughout college. So going to Santo Domingo in particular during training, I just remembered how poverty, wherever it is, has common elements, common characteristics, no matter the culture. Yeah. That's one thing I realized. But the other was it gave me after 2-3 years in the Dominican Republic, really gave me a good picture, better than any civics course or history course could do in school, of why we are how we are in the United States and in the Americas, politically, economically, culturally. So it really changed, really gave me far better than 4 years of higher education could have given me. Not just linguistically, but I think it's all tied together.
Tremendous experience. I had a similar one. I went to college at Holy Cross College in Notre Dame, Indiana, and they have a global immersion program that they do. So you had the opportunity. You could have gone to India or Africa, Mexico. I chose to go to Peru. So we found ourselves in Canto Grande, Peru. It was like something I have never seen before. I mean, roads were not paved. People were living in, what I would describe as huts, little blocks made out of concrete, and it was quite hot down there. We were there, summertime, so it would be wintertime there. It was still, hot as can be. We're running around in sweatshirts and t-shirts, and it was a great time. Great opportunity to kind of get immersed into the language. My Spanish skills, I took Spanish in high school. I took Spanish in college, but, after just 3 weeks of immersion into the culture, I was pretty slick. I was getting around on my own and ordering food in restaurants, accessing the things that I needed to access. I actually got lost for about 12 hours when I was down there. Had dinner with a very nice family who owned a small bodega. It was election day actually on that day, so it was kind of crazy. There was a lot going on. There was like parades in the streets and stuff like that. So we were just so excited to go see what was going on down there. And I got quite lost and spun around and eventually got home on a taxi. But
you got lost, but it sounds like you had some help. You got lost, but they took care of you, eh?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. For
Fantastic.
Sure. Yeah. And,
those experiences are what I call authentic immersion experiences.
Yeah.
As a career immersion educator, there's nothing that can replicate those situations where you're actually living in the culture, getting lost, getting found.
Yeah.
Finding new friends.
Our chaperones were not too impressed with my ability to get home, but they were scared. I got home pretty late that night, so
I bet.
It was something. So
what a story you have.
Yeah. But the immersion, the incredible experience, and like you said, just like the perspective, right? Just the way that we grow up here in America is so different, and other areas of the country, you just gotta really be blessed for what you have. And, just from my perspective, right, as a professional, being able to do the work that I do, to be an advocate for families, for students, for school staff, and, an advocate for PGLS as well. So blessed to do the work that I do, and I'm sure you, 30 years in education, you got to live that every day. And, I've worked in business development for many, many years. I have not always felt great about the products that I've, represented. So, I've sold commercial printing over many years. Well, half of what I sold wound up in a landfill. How good does that feel?
Right,
but when I think about the impact that language, and again, so let's draw this back into the conversation around impact, right? Like I think about the impact that we can make for those families, all across the country. I know that I'm doing good work. I know that you're doing good work. I want to talk to you a little bit about the impact, right? the impact that language services can have on a multilingual family and what that means for participation, behavior, metrics like, social emotional learning and student growth and driving more students to grade level proficiency. How do you see that conversation taking place in schools? And of course, that's evolved so much over the last 30 years. But talk to me a little bit about that one word, impact, and let's discuss that a little bit.
Okay, impact, and we'll start with our experiences. You already kind of touched on it. I'm quite a bit older than you, but even you, probably in a mid-career situation where you are now, you probably have said to yourself in one form or another, that was a gift that keeps giving. My wife served in the Peace Corps too, in a different part of the world, but we're approaching. I'm turning 60 in a couple months, oh, wow. and those experiences are still the gift that keeps giving. Even though I was sent, and the mission was to serve.
Yeah.
As your story kind of shows so eloquently, there were so many times I was being served. When we talk about impact, I'm going there to serve. And there's so many times my counterparts, my neighbors, were actually serving me, and it's still impacting my work to this day. And I'll give you an example. If you're fortunate enough, you and I were able to go and immerse ourselves in a real situation. Yeah. And you garner these close relationships. Valtico was one of my best buddies. We both lived in houses that probably are the same size as my pole barn behind the house here.
Yeah.
I've got about a 20-foot by 10-foot pole barn. That was the size of our houses. He was raising 3 kids with a wife just 5 yards from my house.
In the Dominican, are you talking?
In the Dominican Republic.
Yeah.
I'm back in the Dominican Republic. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Valtico with 3 kids. He had to work the farm all day. That gentleman got me out of more fixes. I'd be in the middle of projects, Peace Corps-oriented projects, and I'd get stuck. Valtico had an 8th grade education, worked every day of his life, trying to feed he was the one that was often getting me out of a lot of times it was just language snafus where I was just confused, and he was able to give me that caretaker speech and figure out where I was confused. Yeah. So that's just one example of how those early immersion, authentically immersed situations are still impactful today in my work out here in Lake County in Michigan. But the key, and you use the term about your work now, how you've been in sales for years, but this work really is fulfilling to you because there's a certain advocacy to what you're doing.
That's what it is. I don't feel like I've ever sold anything while being at PJLS. And you can talk to my sales manager about that.
Very good.
I'm sure he'd like me to be selling more.
Well,
but I don't do any selling, right?
It's a mindset.
It's advocacy. It's, it's partnership. It's thought leadership. That's the way that I position myself in PJLS. And that's where we add a lot of value to the conversation. So, and I'll touch on that a little bit later.
And you can see that if any of your listeners take a look at your, I did some research before I actually started working with you folks. And it is very advocacy based. There is a dearth of quality support for our language minority people from one coast to the next. And no matter the socioeconomic level, but especially our schools that serve impoverished communities. Yeah. One of my biggest battles in northern Michigan is for people like me. People like me are the people that are the principals, the board members, the superintendents. They don't often see the urgency because they may only have a small minority of language minorities.
Right.
Whereas you and I know there's a definite immediate emergency, no matter what your population is, your language minority population.
Yeah.
But even this gentleman who is on the marketing team for your corporation senses the urgency. Even that one family. We had a kindergartner this year, just prior to you and I working together. I think you and I got together early this spring. Yes. And we had a newly arrived family, kindergartner. Now this child, if you were able to get through the linguistic barrier, you would see how ready this child was for kindergarten. He had a mom and dad who doted on him and his little sister, did all the things as a career teacher, because I know I ended my career as an administrator, but I'm a teacher.
Yeah.
And I started my career as a kindergarten teacher. I was always in early elementary, but you could tell those homes that were fortunate enough to have no matter how impoverished they were, they had the resources to get these kids ready for school. Well, this child was one of them. The only thing he lacked was English fluency. Okay. His mom and dad didn't have English fluency either, but this family had agency. Yeah. My administration team, my teachers couldn't see it. They saw it as a burden. How are we going to teach this child?
Yeah.
Give
it 2 years. I bet that kid's flying circles around people.
Oh, give them the end of the semester. I mean, you know how that works. It was like when my daughter was in first grade when we lived in Mexico. I was doing a Fulbright in Mexico, and she was ready. And sure enough, by the time, and this isn't bragging, this is, if you know language learning, my little Talea ended up scoring higher than her class on Mexican standardized tests. Likewise, this kindergarten student I'm telling you about not only ended up flying by the end of the semester, because as you know how skills and concepts go from one code to the next.
Yeah.
As long as we could kind of break that barrier, he was flying. But I think the biggest thing, that the support that you folks can provide, this child was, and his parents especially, were so comforted that they knew the district cared for the child's success by the mere fact that we had someone that could support them linguistically and academically. As one person, he ended up having, we took him to the clinic adjacent to the school. We wouldn't have known this if we didn't have someone that could get into their language, kind of get into the culture, because the parents, because of their culture, they're very reticent to ask for help.
Yeah.
The child had 12 cavities. 2 of his teeth had to be removed. And you can imagine that kind of health issue and the impact that could have had on his learning, but we were able to get to that right away.
Right.
Kind of that, they call it that wraparound service. Well, that's a big part of your work and our work as bilingual educators. When you talk about impact, it's not just about getting through that IEP, because you and I know how much can come out of an IEP. It's not just filling a document and getting a plan together. A lot of times it's a lot of that immediate stuff that's a difference between a child and their family floundering in the system, or a child and their family actually not only having success, but seeing the system as something friendly to them.
Right. Yeah, and that's incredible. So you guys were able to build trust with that family right off the bat by having somebody who was, linguistically capable to communicate with them.
Mm-hmm.
And then they were able to take action, right? They were able to have, meaningful participation, not only in their education, but also, health issues and identifying issues where, you could, really make like back to impact, right? A real impact in that
impact.
Student's
They're a
life.
Cuban family who just parachuted into Michigan by dint of the fact that they heard there was some opportunity in our county. There's some room for new agriculture folks who are kind of agricultural entrepreneurs. And there's a Cuban population in Miami who's identified this, and they're moving into our county. So to your point you're trying to make as far as impact, when they found out, well, they didn't find out. We found out just by doing home visits and getting that relationship together, because again, we had a little of the culture and the language. We had someone who could make that contact. They didn't know that they need petroleum to heat their house. They'd never had to deal with that kind of issue. It wasn't it's just, they didn't know how to live with the type of fuel you need to get through a Michigan winter. We were able to fill up their tank, make sure they had fuel for the winter and they could stay housed. While they learn. I mean, they ended that. You should see them now. They've mastered. You'd think they were born and raised here.
I bet.
But that's the kind of impact we can have as we support the system. We know we've got great teachers. We've got great administrators. We have great parents.
Yeah.
This is a good example. This parent and this child were ready to roll. But if we couldn't break that cultural linguistic barrier, would have been a whole different deal, I bet.
What do you think other parents, so like parents of, English speaking students could be doing is supporting more multilingual families? So, my wife, she is a school psychologist in District 70, and they have some programs, some, family-led, community-led programs that, focus on getting more engagement out of their Spanish-speaking communities, right? And they have parents who advocate and they want these Hispanic-speaking families to come to more events and board meetings and things like that. And I thought that was
Right.
such a neat idea. That they had, interest in, leveraging their student population to, just engage more families and get more families involved, right? So I thought that was just such a neat thing that they're doing. I wonder what thoughts you have on that.
Thank your wife for her work.
Yeah, she's
Because
incredible.
that
She's
also
also in early childhood.
Oh, double
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah,
Those
for
are
real.
good people, and they're key to the work. Our psychologist here in Lake County is got the read on everybody, but not to lose the thread of your question. I think the best way we can do that, I think a good example of it was when I got into teaching back in the early 90s, the last century. We established the first immersion. Immersion now is so common. Almost every district has some sort of immersion program. And there's many immersion programs out there, as many types of immersion programs as there are schools, probably, almost. But what we did in the early 1990s, borrowing on two things, borrowing from the research on language acquisition, but also borrowing on the countries that have already done this successfully, countries that have already dealt with, like Canada, Western Europe, that have dealt with at least two major languages in their culture. See, in America, we've been plural English.
Yeah.
Even though we pride on ourselves on welcoming everybody from around the world, and hoping that bootstraps and grit would get them where we want them.
Yeah.
But we've realized there's a much more natural approach to this, especially if you have confidence that your language learners will master the language given the appropriate context. So getting back to the early 1990s, the Academy of the Americas in Detroit was founded under the understanding that it would be the neighborhood's school. So Detroit Public Schools established a school in the Mexican neighborhood. They call it the Mexican town, but really it's home to Mexican, Central Americans, South Americans. It's a rich, thousands of Latino families live in Southwest Detroit. So there's going to be this neighborhood school. The language of the school will be Spanish. And we're going to try to hire as many Hispanic educators as possible.
Okay.
Now, that was difficult to do now, let alone in 1990s, because as you know, minority teachers are vastly the minority in education. That's how a guy like me ended up being a bilingual educator.
Oh, yeah.
But what we were able to do was maintain the integrity of having the school belong to the neighborhood. And that it was going to be immersion school, and kids from the greater Detroit area are invited to come learn Spanish.
That's cool.
Okay, there's an English component to it. So our Spanish speakers are going to learn English, and our English speakers are going to get English instruction too. Two different strands for those two populations. I don't know if I'm being clear, but by empowering the minority language and the minority culture, and making it attractive to people who are in the majority language and the majority culture, boy, did we have a recipe for success. We had buses coming in from all parts of the city to come to this newfangled immersion program, one of its kind at the time in Michigan. Now you look ahead 30 years, that school now is over 1,000 students strong. I think it's 17% of which the students in this school come from out of the city. Okay. It's actually so attractive. It's bringing people into the city. Whereas, as you probably know, in Detroit, the trend was families leaving the city year after year.
Yeah.
So I hope that kind of addresses your question.
It's in demand. It's in demand.
If we can make it in demand. See, what we're up against is a cultural where one language or one culture is less than the other. But if we can make it attractive, there's always going to be a fraction of our education clientele that are looking for those alternative, those progressive programs. But those of us who've been in it for a generation, there's nothing really progressive about it. It's actually very natural. Yeah. And I think what we've got lost in a lot of our programs, they become more what I call boutique. They're deep in the suburbs. They're Anglo staffs, Anglo students. And it's really taking not just from the authentic immersion. It's taking from what we really intended to do over the last generation or so to try to create more authentic bilingual opportunities for our families.
Yeah, and that's true immersion. That's kids learning on the playground. That's kids learning from one another.
You
That's
know what
great.
I'm talking about. Yeah. And you see it a lot more than you ever did.
Yeah.
But I think that's really the real aim. Just like how you went to Peru, I went to the Dominican. That was authentic.
Yeah.
And we have that capacity here in the United States because the United States doesn't look like you and I. Not anymore, maybe when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But even then it didn't.
No, it's changed
So
for sure.
why aren't our staffs more? But that's a different conversation. But that's where your work and my work fills that vacuum that we have in the United States right now.
Yeah. Well, and perhaps over time, more multilingual students will be inspired to come back and, work in our schools too. And that'll be a lovely thing as well.
That's the hope. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's coming. They're coming.
Yeah.
That's awesome to hear. So, one thing I wanted to touch on with you a little bit, you mentioned, you're up there in Lake County and you have a rural school district. So talk to me about some of the challenges or bottlenecks that exist with a rural school district trying to tackle language access. So let me tee it up a little bit more. So, of course, I partner with big school districts all throughout the country, right? So we're partnered with Fairfax County Public Schools. They're the 11th largest school district in the United States. Phenomenal school district. They have a multilingual department that would be the envy of any school district in the entire United States. I'm telling you, they are incredible people. They fill a tremendous amount of interpretation requests every month. It's just tremendous work. And they're great enough to partner with me, but let me tell you, they don't need me. They do a phenomenal job on their own. But when I think about, and of course, it's great revenue for the organization. It's a great partnership that we have. We love the team at Fairfax County Public Schools, of course. But, when I think about, who benefits from a relationship or an organization like PGLS, it might not make any of us rich, but it's those rural school districts where it's a true language access can be a true bottleneck, right? Because they aren't in the practice of supporting multilingual families day in and day out. So talk to me about your experience with that. And, just give me some perspective on that. Give me some ideas as to how I can be more helpful for those smaller.
For the rural. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is kind of a, compelling terrain because I've been blessed throughout my career. I've taught in Detroit Public Schools. I've taught in rural Dominican schools, a wealthier school in Colombia. Mexico, we were in a Durango public school we were teaching. But this Lake County and it's one of our most rural, it's definitely the poorest, one of the largest county in the state, counties of all the state. So it's really unique for me and I'm learning a lot as well. But I think the key thing is access to resources and access to choices. If you're in a county like Lake County, which exists all through the United States, they're just desperately poor. They depend on tourism, and tourism is the 3 months out of the summer when people come up to fish or to cottage. So my first experience was during the lockdown. During the lockdown, they surveyed our parents and they decided, because they live in, most of our households are grandmas, moms, dads, it's multi-generational, there's big houses, and the parents overwhelmingly wanted us to close down into remote.
Okay.
Which we wanted to honor. But boy, we had miles and miles of, state forest. People were all over the county. We had to not only find them, we had to get to them, and we had to provide them the services they needed for remote learning, laptops. But one of the biggest problems we had is it's a cyber wasteland. They don't have internet.
Oh, wow.
At one point, I was taking to people's houses these little, what they were, little hockey puck size from Verizon. We bought a bunch of I'm losing my English right now.
Like a hotspot?
Thank you. Hotspots throughout the county.
Yeah.
But then you'd end up being in a house that there's too many trees, the hotspot, maybe I had to get more. So there was a huge logistical issue with just the tech part of instruction during the lockdown.
Yeah.
And then you also had to feed people. We were sending buses out. I mean, we were driving dirt roads, twisty dirt roads to deliver people their food. So there's that kind of logistics. But what that lockdown enabled us to see is very intimately where everybody is and what these families are dealing with. Because we as educators, we have certain expectations, right? But we have to know our client. We have to know, well, a very poor rural community has very special needs.
Yeah.
So when we came back to school, knowing even more intimately what we're dealing with, we tried to address that. And one of them was trying to create better transportation opportunities for our people, for our families, trying to create ways to meet them without them always having to come into town. So if you're in the northern end of the county, and first of all, you got to find transportation to get to town, but you've got a good 45-minute drive to get there.
Okay.
Especially with weather, inclement weather, trying to deal with that with our families and trying to make it more, if we truly are about our families, we have to be about addressing the barriers, not just to their learning, but the healthcare. The clinic that's adjacent to our school has to be, staffed with people that know how to deal with the diabetes, the typical problems, the dental care. That our families, the particular issues they're dealing with. So I think the biggest issue is not just the funding, but getting the talent that can really get a real intimate idea of the families and their needs so that the schools can respond. And to get back to what I said earlier, so the school is less of this, especially in poor areas, schools can often be perceived as kind of a dangerous place. It's where I can get outed for something. Often families are worried. They're very self-conscious of maybe being outed for something.
Multilingual families or families in general?
Families in general.
Okay.
I'm talking about families, but even our minority language families.
Okay.
They're always suspicious about what we need to know about their information, their either immigration status or the work status. So that takes a lot of trust building.
Yeah.
And when you don't look like you're from their culture, they can sense it in New York minute. It's on us to try to break down that barrier, get them to trust us. And often that occurs during the tough times when the rubbers meet in the road. Maybe the parents are having a really hard time. Yeah. And you can't just come through for them. You have to show that you really care for them. If they're coming in very upset, or if they don't, if you need to be able to read if they're upset, if they're trying to hide it, and constantly show that you're not just on the side of the system, which is tough, right?
Yeah,
we have to be obedient to our system,
right?
But if we're not ultimately obedient to our clientele,
right?
And in impoverished communities that we work in, it's kind of tough because we're always at that cultural, it's kind of like I always call it, well, with me, it's like a cultural pothole. I'm not from that very unique culture called poverty.
Yeah.
So I hope I've answered your question, but I tell you that question, we could probably run a good series of podcasts on our work in poverty.
Well, I knew we'd get down the rabbit hole of impact and we'd find all sorts of things to talk about.
Yeah.
Give me some ideas, for how you build trust and promote and stimulate engagement for those families that, bilingual families that, it's so important to, build that credibility and trust. So, what tools and techniques are you using to do that as you get out into the community?
This is where I reach out. Peace Corps taught us so much. Peace Corps, really, their training is all about community work. Yeah. And not expecting to be the savior, not expecting to swoop in and build that international airport in your first months of service. It's really about getting to know the people. And I know it's cliche, but it's all about relationships. So what does that look like? In my experience, it's living in the community. I know that's difficult for a lot of educators, if not impossible to live in the community, and especially in rural areas, because the housing is tough. It's tough to house teachers. But if you can at least live near there and be very visible. Okay. So you're at the ball games. And this is hard for educators who have families, because you have your own obligations, but trying to be at the ball games, those home visits are essential. And I say that with an asterisk because home visits, that's a hollow ground when you make home visits. And if you look like me, you can be very threatening.
Yeah.
So, we could do a whole different podcast on how to do home visits in cultures that aren't yours. They're very special cultures. They're not my culture. I'm always the guest.
Yeah.
Home visit being very visible. When you're out at, I know this sounds silly, but again, this could be a podcast. When you're out on that parent pickup line at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day, when those kids are getting in and out of the cars, either want to be there or act like you want to be there, even if it's pouring rain, man. These are your people, you're shepherding, you'd be out in the parking lot, opening doors, getting kids in and out of cars, that kind of thing.
Okay.
When the bus line comes in, you're at that bus cheering those kids in the bus. I know that sounds so superficial and silly, but we do fall short because our jobs are hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to put on that face. It's hard to be authentic about it.
Yeah.
But if you remember your why,
yeah,
I have a lot of good colleagues that remind me of my why, because sometimes I can go off on my own. If you know your why, you'll do it. And fortunately, we're blessed with so many, I'm sure, too, educators that are just above and beyond. They're such a part of their students and their students' families' lives.
It blows me away, and reflecting on the lengths that school leaders will go to support their community. It's incredible. Mm-hmm. I could go again. I'll have more podcast guests. Trust me. Of just educators who go the extra mile to support.
Well, that's right. I'm probably speaking to choir because there's so many heroes you and I work with. But if anything, my answers can affirm the work that's being done out there because it's tough work. I don't like falling into sports analogies, but the best one is, I grew up playing baseball and a good hitter was failing 7 times out of 10. I know we've beaten that maxim to death. But y'all out there are doing great work. It doesn't seem like it because in poverty, especially in poverty, but even in our wealthier districts, but in poverty, it's so hard to see the wins. Yeah. Because it's such a challenging environment.
Let's spend a few minutes unpacking that. So when we originally spoke, we talked a little bit about the impact of socioeconomic status and then the effect that has on language acquisition. So, in your 30-year career, talk to me about what you've seen out there, to that extent.
As far as socioeconomic,
the impact of socioeconomic status on language acquisition.
Okay, if I'm teaching or administering in Lake County, I'm using an entirely different set of skills than I am if I'm teaching in the wealthy Forest Hills Public Schools of Michigan.
Okay.
Where our bond has not been approved the last 3 times we posed it out here. It's very hard to get bond. Whereas you can count on it in Forest Hills, and then some. You've got booster programs. You've got, but also behaviors and expectations are different.
Yeah.
Right. You have an urgency culture here. Folks are living paycheck to paycheck at best. There's an urgency thing. They want their kids to, when they send their kids to the school that they're not always confident with, but they know they have to send their child to school. They want to make sure they're clothed, they're respected, and they're taken care of. In a wealthier district, there's far more pressing and a broader menu of urgencies in a wealthier district generally. So I have to change my gear. And what I see in an impoverished district, you almost feel like you need to be militant as a disciplinarian, which I say you don't need to. That's a whole different. Whereas if I were trying to be a militant disciplinarian in a wealthier district, and I'm speaking broadly, this is a broad brush, don't even try it. There's a whole different layer of advocacy for kids in a wealthier school than in an impoverished school. I don't know if I'm being clear, but where I could, I want to be delicate about this, but
think it through. Think it through.
Generally speaking, being an educator in a impoverished district is a different job. And I'd love your wife to be a part of this because as a psychologist, she sees this.
She's home for the summer. You want me to go get her?
Oh, it'd be interesting to see here too, but because she understands trauma,
Yeah.
right? And there's differences. It's not that there's not trauma in wealthier districts. There's
Yeah.
trauma.
It's different though. She does work for an affluent district, and the problems are different, and parent participation looks different, right? And expectations are different. So, I can definitely see how that affects learning
But
outcomes too.
that goes back to our work. It goes back to where it's just like you've worked in different corporations in your career.
Yeah.
You still have the same skill set, the same training, the same experience, but every corporation you probably have to tailor your skill set to your clientele.
That's a good analogy. I like that. That's interesting. Very cool. Now, is that something you picked up over time? Like you learned that trial and error?
Yeah, I had really good mentorship at the beginning of my career, where the great Byrne was our principal, and Lydia Lopez. They were great. Detroit, Teresa Rodriguez, a great bilingual, like Detroit hallmarks back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they were the first ones that were able to teach a guy like me the effects of trauma on education, that the effective part of teaching is just as important. And I know there's a debate out there about this, but as the standardized test scores and achievement games, and that's all important, and that's the measuring stick.
Yeah.
But they're the ones that taught me and showed me. These are the type of administrators that were willing to come into my class, take it over, and show me how they would do it. They showed me how they fell on their face. They get into a bind in my class, teaching my class, and did you see how I struggled there, Tim? And did you see how I dealt with it this way? And they always had, as they were explaining to me, as they were training me and mentoring me and teaching, it was always peppered with effective comments about the kid. It wasn't just about curriculum. It wasn't just about measurements. It was always something they knew about that child and how that child might react. They'd see how I'd escalate a child, and in their mind, you never escalate a child. It'll happen. You'll stumble over yourself or stumble into something.
Yeah.
But you have to make a pledge yourself. You do not escalate a child. You de-escalate that child. You do no harm.
Yeah.
No matter their situation. So I don't know how well I'm answering the question, because this is something I'm still working on 30 some years in education.
I don't think there's an answer to it, right? It's just experience and constantly trying to improve yourself, right?
Back to something you so nicely emphasized, we are surrounded by great colleagues who get it. Some of them come in with a very natural empathy. Some of them, like me, had to learn it and relearn it over and over. But especially when you're in a culture so distinctly different, we might share the same country, but are impoverished, are in a culture that's so. I have more in common with a billionaire. I'm just a teacher, public school teacher. I know this sounds like an exaggeration, but I probably have more in common with a billionaire than I do with someone who's 2-3 generations into poverty. Yeah, that's just me speaking, but I think it's that foreign of a culture to most America.
Yeah, it's not fun going to bed with a hungry belly. That's for sure. I can't even imagine.
And everything that goes with it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. My goodness. Yeah, I know that all too well, unfortunately. But thanks to great educators, myself, I've been given great opportunities and learned so much, and just continue to excel. So interesting. So you brought up achievement gaps, right? And I think a lot of educators can get bogged down in students reaching grade level proficiency or student growth. But talk to me about the types of things that you're measuring in addition to proficiency and growth. Talk to me about some of the things that you're measuring on a day-to-day basis when it comes to supporting multilingual students.
I'm testing their native language proficiency. To me, that's usually when I do that, I'm looking below the tip of the iceberg. I'll give you an example with Alex, my little kindergartner. I was conscious, he was already a reader. If you had given me this student 30 years ago, because he didn't speak English, He's a non-reader to me. In my mind, he's a non-reader. As I was trained as an acquisitionist, I was trained as a bilingual teacher. No, you only learn to read once. This young man came to me as a kindergartner already. He read in Spanish.
Oh, wow.
Not just decoding, he could read, obviously but you could tell mom and dad read to them every day. You could just tell.
That's cool.
And then when I was able to assess him in Spanish, I could show evidence. I could go to the principal and say, hey, look, we need to handle him a little differently in the classroom because he's already literate. We don't need to teach him as if he's learning to read. We need to just transfer those skills to English.
Okay.
So, we do a little more phonic work with him so he could learn the English code.
Yeah.
But a lot of his other learning activities were structured around being a reader, reading for context in English, reading and giving him gobs of language, not just the phonics. The phonics were important, but so I think that's a kind of a good example of how we approach it differently.
Yeah.
Look for their strengths in their native language, just like we look for strengths in their native culture. If I see, I knew this young man was coming from a home, it was an impoverished home, but mom was cooking meals at home. They had a garden. But there were books. When I'd make a home visit, I'd see there were books there, children's books. There was some toys. So I knew they had ability to manipulate things in play. So I could see how many assets this boy was going to. And on the books, when you looked at them in the front office, you're like, oh my gosh, we're getting a newborn baby. This child doesn't know any English. No, we're looking at a child that otherwise is very ready for kindergarten. He'd be the one we'd prize. This child's going to make me look good, right? That kind of child.
Yeah.
Except they're looking at his language disability. He doesn't have a disability.
Okay.
He's already shown us he can read. If he can read in Spanish, he can read in English.
All right.
And I think that's the biggest thing.
That's an interesting thought. I'd not considered that as a, way to kind of evaluate a student's ability to, pick up, language acquisition skills. That's fascinating to me.
Oh, it's crucial if they already have it, because if you talk to a lot of people, and there's a lot of literature about this. So a couple of our books in our school library in Lake County, in Baldwin Community Schools, there's a couple novels. Pardon me, they're autobiographies of there's one about a Vietnamese. She came over here from Vietnam as a young girl, and how she was treated as if she were an empty vessel because she didn't speak the language. She acted differently, and instead of looking at these students as, wait, what do they bring from their native culture and native language that we can build upon? Because they'll tell if you're moving them 10 steps back. My daughter experienced it in Mexico. I mean, She was ready for the math lessons. She could get it. She didn't know the language, but she could figure it out with the context. She was ready for that stuff. And even for a lot of the reading, she just needed a little support to get there. Yeah. As opposed to just assuming they're empty vessels, and then you're not even remediating them. They're kind of stuck in this pre-reading mode.
Yeah, if you don't push them forward, then they just get further and further behind.
If you don't, and this is, as you know, I mean, my teaching, the one of the biggest things I learned early in my career, these formative assessments where I'm constantly assessing. Well, the key for that is making sure, A, I'm not moving too fast beyond the student, but B, also, I'm not having them dwell on concepts they already know.
Right.
Okay. So I think that's what we're doing much better now in bilingual education, and through supports like what your corporation can help us with, is finding where that child is authentically, not just in English, because they'll get the English, just like you and I got the Spanish from being dropped into Peru and the Dominican Republic.
Yeah.
But we have the ability, if we can find where they really are in their native language, native culture, we can give them a really good start ahead. Even for like our kindergarten teachers in bilingual, but she did them with our supports, with us able to kind of coach her and say, hey, look, this is what he's doing in Spanish. This is what we said. Yeah, she did phenomenal with this boy. First of all, she won his heart.
Yeah.
This child really wanted to do good for her because she was that loving and skillful, and she was willing to kind of pivot from what she thought was the right practice to what she was informed might be better.
Yeah.
That's probably something you see too in your work, when you work in these different schools, to see these teachers actually they've got good solid practice. Yeah. They're phenomenal teachers, but now we're giving them this new situation, this bilingual or this monolingual child from a different culture, and with a little help, showing them where this the holistic picture of where this child is. He's not just a kid who doesn't know English.
Right.
Right.
Anyway. Incredible. Well, it's awesome to hear that success story. And, I'm sure, that's a student that your kindergarten teacher, she's going to remember her whole life,
Yeah. And that's the beauty of it. It goes both ways. The parents just adore this woman, this young teacher. And she just, she rightfully feels like she got a win out of this.
Yeah.
It was very, you teachers who listen to this podcast, you know how intimidating that is. I'm with you. You get that new student and you want to do right by them.
Amazing. Well, that's awesome. One other thing I wanted to transition to, we talked at the onset a little bit about the work that we do around language access planning. Tim, is that a concept that you're familiar with? Have you heard that?
Language access planning?
Language access planning.
No.
Interesting. Okay. So, what I found, many federal institutions, so not the Department of Education yet, but many federal institutions. So like, for example, Housing and Urban Development, they've produced, a really tremendous language access plan that's out there that does a great job of helping those people, working in housing in this example, identify best practices and supports for, supporting, families that are bilingual. And, I'm expecting, I've had conversations with folks at the DOE. I'm expecting that they're going to put out some guidelines and, some advice as to how schools should administer and put together a language access plan. So I know that's coming from our friends at the DOE, the Office of Civil Rights. So looking forward to, some guidance at the federal level. But PGLS is in the process of developing a program ourselves, which we're rolling out to school districts. And we're going to do some trials with some of our district partners here in the coming months, and we'll create a really formalized campaign. But it's going to be a great program, and I feel like schools tend to, as it relates to language access, it can be a tremendous bottleneck in terms of getting information out to school leaders, training folks on how to access an interpreter is a tremendous challenge. So I would suggest that if a multilingual teacher didn't think that they could get an interpreter available in 90 seconds, I would think that would be a problem for a district. And that's part of what we solve for on the professional development front in PGLS. So we've developed some really cool content. We're going to roll that out here this quarter, focused on best practices for optimizing the impact of language services in a K-12 setting, tips and tricks and best practices around fostering and driving engagement amongst families. And then, from there, working through KPIs with districts. So key performance indicators like fill rates and, all sorts of initiatives, like, for example, like delivering translated documents in advance to a family, 3 days in advance of a meeting, things like that. Things that
wonderful.
Things that should be, I think, common practice within schools. But because supporting multilingual families is such a real challenge, I don't think that schools have kind of conceptualized all the resources they have, created a single platform or a program where they can educate their staff as to all the resources that are available, how to get access to those.
Yeah.
Who are those champions for language access at the building level that you could tap and say, hey, I need to talk to Tim because Tim knows everything about our language access programs. And if I can get Tim, he can help me solve for X, Y, and Z as it relates to supporting this multilingual family. So we're in the process of formalizing a program. It's going to be.
Thank you.
What do
I
you
wrote that down. I got some homework to do. I'm taking notes. Continue.
Oh yeah,
This is compelling.
I will. I'll send you our first draft on that because I'd love to get your feedback on that.
I like to hear that the feds, because the feds, this is just an old educator talking. They get a bad rap. All of us have a hard time with the bureaucracy, but this is another case where the feds are trying to advocate for our most vulnerable students.
Yes.
And I like to see corporations like if I can do a little plug for you folks, you're trying to get ahead of the curve, because it sounds like language access planning is something you're hearing in the works with the feds.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And the Department of Ed does a phenomenal job. I love that group of educators.
What I'm getting at is this is a great case of where the feds and the free market come together to serve our kids. Okay. I mean, you folks are getting ahead of the curve because you see that this is coming down the pipe and you've already done your job. You're already advocating, because Fournier now is going to start looking into this.
Yep.
But the feds are going to make sure they're going to keep educators like me, my feet to the fire to make sure those kids are served by being transparent.
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like if I'm listening.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I got my homework to do. That's fantastic. And the fact that we know that there's folks like you out there, organizations like yours, who are going to help us be in compliance.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And then
wonderful.
The other thing I'll
Civil
mention,
Rights.
yeah, no, and that's a great group of educators, and I got a lot of insights from them at the NABI conference that I was at in New Orleans a couple months ago. So I got to sit with them, and I asked them, I see all these federal organizations putting out guidelines around language access planning. Are you guys going to do something similar? And they said it's coming. And we both smiled, ear to ear, and we know that these guidelines. It's going to help school leaders a great deal. So I'm excited to be able to put something together on behalf of PGLS, but I'm also excited.
Still see me, but you're frozen.
Oh, no. I still see you. Can you hear me? No, now you're
I'll stay on. I think we're frozen here. Oh, there we are.
Okay, I see you. Yeah, it's saying my internet connection's unstable.
It's probably my age, my side here. We have spotty internet.
Well, anyways, yeah. So I'm glad that you see the need and the demand for that.
Oh, absolutely.
We're also introducing an interpreter training program in conjunction with that, the language access planning component. So really, just diving in and making sure that we can provide educational supports through our training academy. Piedmont Academy is kind of part of our outlook for the language access planning. It's going to be a great program. I'm looking forward to collaborating.
Well, I'll keep a close eye on your website, because this is something that really interests me. If this is on the federal level, just so you can tell your boss you got a lot done this morning or this afternoon, because I'm going into town to talk to my assistant superintendent. He's going to hear about this. Knowing him, he's like you. He probably's already on top of this, but I'm going to make sure he knows this is coming down the pike.
Well, and so what I've heard, is Michigan is one of those states that has taken, a really proactive response to language access. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing a lot of states introduce legislation beyond what the feds are doing as well. So like in Illinois, for example, which is where I'm from, they have all sorts of legislation recently introduced to support multilingual families within the special education process. And I'm seeing states, all across the country, from Colorado to New Jersey, piggyback on that type of legislation. So that type of conversation just continues to reinforce the importance of having a plan, being able to push that information from a compliance standpoint out into those communities. And PGLS looks forward to being a leader on that front too.
Fantastic.
So we'll be really excited to have your friendship and your your willingness to look at that program when it's kind of at a stage of completion. We're going to be pushing forward with that. It's going to be a lot of fun, and certainly something that's needed. But anyways,
beautiful.
Thanks for your thoughts on that. I appreciate it. Well, Tim, we've been talking for an hour. I think we could talk for 3. I don't want to take up too much of your time this afternoon. It's a Friday after all, so I want you to get out and enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend. But
my pleasure.
I appreciate you for stepping to the lectern today. I have a feeling that this will not be the first or the last time. It is the first. It will not be the last.
There you go. Okay.
I appreciate you so much, and thank you for all the work that you do to support the students in your community. And thank you for coming on and talking with all of our listeners. We really appreciate you. And I hope you have a
pleasure. It's great working with you and with your organization. And thank you for the opportunity. We're kind of bilingual geeks here. I could talk all day about it. I'm sure.
And you know what? We didn't even get into advice for interpreters working in a K-12 setting, and that's something I wanted to talk to you about today too. So you have to come back on with me another time.
We'll revisit that. It would be my pleasure. Seriously. Good work you're doing out there.
We got to. All right.
We'll talk soon.
I'll be in touch. We'll certainly be talking, and have a great weekend. Okay.
Great work. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Bye now.